Kayla, I just want to confirm with you that you've started Otter.ai. If you can just get that started, and then we can go ahead with that while you work on the Facebook Live.
Yes.
Great, thank you, Kayla. That is, so I will actually start with thanking Kayla Myers, who is our series producer for the DocYard. She works tirelessly behind the scenes. You heard her voice just now, connecting us to Facebook Lives, moderating the Facebook Live chat and our chat here in the Zoom webinar, booking films, making sure that delivery of all of our materials, everything is done on time, processing all of the invoices, even writing program notes of her own. So she's really kind of a jack of all trades, and I could not do this without Kayla. I'd also like to thank Lyda and Jen, our colleagues at the Left Foundation, of which the DocYard is a program, as well as the Brattle Theater, our venue partner for the DocYard since the beginning. Even though we are online and virtual these days, the Brattle is still our trusted partner. And they now also have their own streaming service, the Brattleites. So I suggest that everybody check that out. It has revivals and repertory titles, unlike a lot of other virtual cinemas these days. We are recording this Q&A for YouTube, and at any point, please send us your questions in chat or via the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. I will be incorporating questions at any time. My name is Abby Sun, and I am the curator of the DocYard. And I am an Asian American woman with shoulder-length black hair. I'm wearing a black dress. I can sort of see my scarf around my neck. It's falling off at this moment. And I'm in a white room with a bookshelf behind my head. We are here to talk about Jordan Lord's first feature documentary, Shared Resources, which I find an extraordinarily vulnerable, personal, and stridently political film. It addresses a lot of things that are very trendy right now, but in ways that do not hew at all to the commercialized market pressures of the conventional documentary film. The film is about a personal and political history of debt, what it both gives us and what it might take away. I have so much to dive into with Shared Resources as a film. So Jordan, thank you so much for helping us with the screening, with you handling everything yourself, and for being here tonight.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Abby. Thank you so much to Kayla for managing all of the different technical aspects of it currently, as well as all of the amazing prep work that you did to make this event and screening possible. A visual description of myself. I'm a white person with a beard. I have like quite short, balding hair. I'm wearing a purple shirt. I'm in a kind of darkish room that has a bookcase behind me. And can you remind me what the name of this fig tree is called, Abby?
The DocYard.
The fig tree. Sorry, you're telling me the name of the fig tree.
We confirmed that it was a fiddle leaf fig behind Jordan in our pre-call.
Okay, a fiddle leaf fig tree is behind me. So yeah, I'm very, very happy to be here. Yeah, excited to talk to you.
Yeah, okay, so I have so many questions. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about the film, because we are living in a time right now where the accountability, the ethics of documentary films are really at the forefront of the conversation, not only within film criticism, within, academia, but also extending to the funding space, extending to the evaluation of films. And, so I guess I do want to start, first of all, one of the things that we talked about was shared resources as a longitudinal project, one that was iterated in several forms, including a short film that you made with your mother and with other relatives, which you told me we get a very tiny glimpse of at the end of Shared Resources. This is not the first film that you've made in collaboration with your family. I'm curious if you consider it actually a collaboration, because that's the word in co-creation that are frequently used in the industry these days. But in the credits of your film, you actually say that it's in consultation with your parents, which is a different set of terminology and terms. I'm wondering if you can describe your process for the film as a larger project and how you prepared your parents and your sister for participating.
Yeah, so just to start with your first question, I don't think that it would be appropriate to call it a collaboration,
Mhm.
in the same way that, for instance, the short film that I made with my mom, I Can Hear My Mother's Voice, like I literally say like I co-directed that film with her because that is the process of how we did it. I asked her, to come up with what she wanted to film. I directed the project in the sense of like I had the idea that I would teach her how to use the camera, and everything else she shot and determined what she wanted the film to be. And then I came back in with this process of description. This film was quite different in the sense that it the process really both predates that film. I mean, I started making this film in 2015. And before that, I really had never made documentary before. I actually didn't have very many thoughts, particularly about documentary, other than maybe like some documentaries that I had seen and that I had thought about. And something that really struck me about documentary very early on, and I actually kind of like, I really have to credit Stephen Winter's like quasi-fictional films, Jason and Shirley, which I think was maybe made around 2015, which is a kind of reimagining of how Shirley Clarke's portrait of Jason was made, and a kind of like thinking through of the extractive means by which that film may or may not have been made. It's a fictional piece, but it's a speculation. And thinking about the camera as an apparatus of capture, thinking about like what are strategies that pure performers or people in films use to kind of avoid being captured or pinned down. And a lot of like the language that I was developing about like the interview, for instance, about like how it becomes an account that like sticks to the person. Those were things I was thinking about like very early on before I'd ever actually even made the film. But I didn't know how I was going to deal with that. And so a lot of this was kind of like trial and error. And I have to kind of like really own up to that, because I think that there are aspects of what I did in making this film that like I would not call like purely ethical or something like this. A lot of the film was shot where, I had told my family that I wanted to make this film. I made sure that it like we only included things that they felt comfortable with. But at the same time, like I understand that as like my parents' child, as you're seeing so many different moments in the film, they're going to allow me leeway that they wouldn't allow another person. And so that was something I was always having to like, I was simultaneously having to hear what they said of like, you can shoot whatever you want, while also knowing that there were going to be things that they were not going to want to be shown. Meanwhile, I had this like real feeling of like being caught between like, there are at least three different layers of like what my sense of responsibility was like in the film, which is like, the responsibility for me to like present some version of what I understood to be, my parents' reality, to know that that had to be balanced with how they each saw it, while also knowing that like they would see it differently, in fundamental ways. So all of this is probably getting too far beyond the initial question, but knowing that those were all questions like I was ultimately responsible for answering, that then, I tried to pose them to them as much as possible. And you're seeing as many times as that's happening, like, through the conversation about the contract, through the conversation about like what my dad did or didn't want to be seen. But I think it would be really misleading to call it a collaboration, because that like I feel like would be a real flattening of like the very real still like, imbalances in power, and the fact that like even just the very fact that like you're talking to me right now. You're not talking to my parents and me. And that, you know, in the previous times I've done Q&As, I have invited them to be here to try to like keep that space more open. But I really do think that, you know, there's something about like a kind of like deferral of responsibility as well, I think, in like saying that my parents collaborated on it as opposed to saying that they consulted on it, because I feel that I need to still, you know, take on the responsibility of like, you know, these were choices that I made to continue to show certain things. You know, I'm not sure, like my dad may have just like gotten rid of the footage altogether, you know, of the day where he felt, you know, the kind of footage that he's talking about that he doesn't want people to see, that you're still hearing audio of. He has since said that like that's a kind of compromise or you know, a meeting him somewhere in between that he feels moved by or meaningful, you know, as a form of connection between us. And so I'm glad that I did that, but like, you know, that was still ultimately a choice that I made that probably would have been different than the one he had made if he was the person in the editing room actually, you know, deciding, do we keep this or do we get rid of it? So
Yeah. I mean,
and
I'm
I
really
forget whether there was a question or sorry.
I mean, it was also about, yeah, I mean, these are, I think, really important questions because I have long thought that this current trend towards collaboration and co-created film is an attempt to solve something that shouldn't be solved in documentary filmmaking, this
Yeah.
unequal power balance. Instead of, you know, confronting it or making it legible, you know, I don't see it as a solution, but more as like a symptom of the way that things are. And to me, you know, you're to phrase it in the language of shared resources, you're not only assuming responsibility, but you're sort of also assuming the risk of the ethical practices in your film. Because I find that oftentimes when, you know, subjects or participants are asked to be on stage, it's performative in a manner. It's like the audience asking them, like, were you okay? Right? Like, are you okay with this film? What happened to you? And it's like evidence that they were not harmed by the film, right? When the truth can be a
Yeah.
lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I'm actually so grateful you put it into that language, because I actually think that that's so much of what I find really frustrating about the ways in which like the access agreement or something like this is framed, is that access becomes a code word for permission. And when access and permission are conflated, I think that's like a tremendously like dangerous thing to like to confuse those two things, because just to say like, because I think the audience in some sense is maybe saying like, do I have permission to enjoy this, right? Like if I also have to recognize that this maybe is something that you don't feel good about, like that I absorbed this as a form of entertainment, or you know, or whatever, you know, not to reduce all film watching to entertainment, but I took something from this, but you feel, you know, not okay about that. Well, like, yeah, of course. Like my dad's saying in a Q&A that like this is something that he's come to terms with, or that, you know, he feels moved by the decisions that I made. Like that doesn't change the fact that I know that it hurt him, you know, and that it is something that still it doesn't feel he doesn't like rewatching the film, you know, like I can say that, you know, and that's something that, as you're saying, exactly, like I knew that I was going to have to take on that risk in making the film, that it would not only be, you know, something that would be in our relationship, but also in how other people relate to the film going forward. Because it's, I think it is a perfectly legitimate thought to have, like, you know, it's never somebody's like right to take another person's life and do with it what they want, but there are contracts that exist to give them that right. And but I think to like to kind of like try to like avoid the question of like how that giving over of a right often like becomes like a property relation, and the kind of violence of that, like I think is, that to me was what I didn't want to do as much as possible, while recognizing that I was still going to be engaging in something that would be hard and painful. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so because you did mention the interview with your father, but there's a couple of them, but at one point you did mention the interview in the middle. I would like to take the time to kind of, I hate the word, like the phrase pick apart, but to like also, but also delve deeper. You know, all these metaphors don't seem to actually work. But to just discuss more this kind of really central, it's one of the longest interview scenes in the
Yeah.
film, and it's the hinge structurally. It's right in the middle, and it's the point that draws a lot of lines together, even rhetorically, because in this film it's about what happened to your family after your parents declared chapter 13 bankruptcy, um health wise, mentally, financially, familially, um and the film is sort of bookended by this crisis point that happened while you were there filming on break, along with your parents' kind of interactions with your filmed materials of that scene. But in the middle here, we have something a little bit different because we'd already known at this point that your dad was a debt collector of some sort and has some sort of expertise in this area. This has been a repeated theme, this idea of debt and how it's structured in this country and within the practice of documentary film. But this is where you talk about specifically that line that you mentioned, quote, the interview extracts information from the interviewee. And there's a quite interesting, and then you go on to list, you know, the types of information that is extracted. And then there was a really interesting moment right then, when your dad actually looks at the camera when talking about settling his mother's affairs because his brothers didn't want to handle it. He's looking at you, talking to you, the filmmaker, Jordan, for like the rest of this scene or the cuts in the scene. But at the end of telling the story about your grandfather's 26 credit card, or actually I think it's right before the credit card reveal, it's about like settling the affairs, he looks at the camera briefly and says, and if they're watching this someday, I hope they know they hurt me as much as her. um so, you know, that's just one moment where I find actually that your parents are addressing, like they have this awareness of this larger audience, and it might be like just own family. And this becomes also a tool for that. I'm curious, like those moments, if you can pick them apart for us, like what did they
Mm.
mean for you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that a lot of why the film became the film that it is, and I guess in this sense, it's like, you know, the genre boundedness of like documentary, like I find it useful in the sense that like there's conventions, tropes, and like ethical, particular like, ethical stakes and claims and infrastructures, but like, you know, that we don't like talk about documentary always like also thinking through questions of performance. Like I think there's definitely a lot of layers of performance that are happening in the film, particularly with my mom and dad. And of course, it's different because they're performing themselves. But I think so. I think there's that element of the kind of awareness of the camera and how that's, you know, shaping the way that things are. I think then there is also this, you know, which I think has everything to do with like, I get this sense that like, given that my dad kind of gave the same, and I think this is also part of why I was thinking about interviews in the same way, or sorry, thinking about interviews in this way of like extracting information about them and then kind of like being frozen as like there's some kind of like adherence between like the interview and the truth of the person, and that this has everything to do with kind of like the mise en scène of the interview, where you're kind of like isolating the person from the things around them so that we can focus on just, we're just on the person, you know, and as if that's supposed to give us the truth of how they are. But of course, as I know from like interviewing my dad, like he basically said the same things every single time I interviewed him. Like he knew what he wanted to say. And he also kind of had this awareness that he had this platform for like self-making that he knew he wanted to control to some degree. And I think that that has a lot to do with why then the rest of the film unfolds the way that it does, because it's not just the interviews, there's also like a moment where like my dad's telling his dream to the camera. Yeah. Like this was like a choreographed moment that my dad knew like he was going to be in control of like what story was being told. And then me and my mom like messed him up like by bringing up like this dreams thing that he was like, you know, it's not about dreams, it's about dreams. And so I think that was a big part of it. You know, and then I think certainly there are other moments where I think my parents are like using the film as like a device in their own lives. And I think the clearest moment of that is of course like my mom kind of confronting my dad about like her not knowing like who like what they owed, you know, how they owed, like things like this. Like I know that like she's saying she did it before the film, and I'm not trying to take credit for any of that, but I think what I can say is like that was the first time I had heard her speaking to my dad in that way, and that maybe it was in some sense like this kind of like being seen by, because so much of the film I guess like brings up this thing of like not only like how does one see them oneself, but also like what is it to be seen by another person, and particularly like what is it to be seen by me, and then the possibility of being seen by unknown others. And I get this sense that like having a witness for those things, like my mom like really kind of like doubles down on this idea that it like that having a witness for like what she's experienced in a way that like she felt was like negated by my dad's perspective of it, like was going to somehow be then you know, like made possibly like make something else possible, and like what they were going to communicate to each other, knowing that other people might see it and like be able to like affirm that she saw the same thing. Of course, I'm not sure that that's necessarily what the film does. Like the film like puts that into play as a possibility. But of course, there's also always this friction and dissonance between like what's being mediated by the description, how the people who are in it are seeing it, versus of course then that's going to then be like remediated by each audience's experience of it and perception of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what makes the film extraordinary is that everyone in the film is operating on all of these levels of performance. I guess I would push back a little bit on the idea that in documentary people are not interested in the idea of performance, because this is precisely the exact controversy that Nanook of the North is embroiled in, right? Like how much did the people you know, understand the film as a performance versus, you know, what it was. But
no, absolutely. And I guess, yes.
Sorry, not to kind of harp on that, but to me, you know, sorry, feel free to respond to that. I don't also mean to like have the last word on that. I think the
no, definitely not
clear, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I guess it's like that's like always the question in yeah, of course, because you know there's this whole, whether it's like, you know, the awareness of the camera makes people do certain things in like the tradition of cinema verite, and I know that like you kind of like made like a kind of like Rushian association to the film and like the text that you wrote about it, as well as like yeah, of course, if we're talking about Nanook, or even then like the supposed things are like observational cinema about like how people behave when they don't, you know, they're not as aware of the camera being, you know, around, and kind of this idea of like, you know, the camera catching people in the act. Yeah, of course, these questions of performance are always there. I guess the thing I was literally just thinking about was like, and this is a really silly thing, and I could have actually literally misread this video, but like I was literally just watching this video last night with my boyfriend that was like a breakdown of like the RuPaul's Drag Race contract, like the contestants like have to engage in order to participate in the show. And I was thinking, oh wow, it actually sounds like the release of rights agreement that the the contestants have to sign, I mean, it's much more intricate, but it's like not dissimilar from like maybe like the conventional documentary contract. And what struck me was that the compensation terms seem to be, and again, I could be wrong, but my perception of it was they were saying that the compensation actually comes from giving up their rights, that it's like a compensation for it's like a rights release
Yeah,
payment agreement, like
that's
based on each episode, rather than it being a performer based compensation agreement. And so that's, I guess, the thing I was thinking about is just like how like there's some kind of like labor question around performance that documentary, like the boundedness of like genre, the documentary is somehow like troubles, even though of course there are the all of these conversations about should you pay the people who are in your film as a documentary filmmaker and like what it means to do that. But I was thinking maybe like that distinction of performer happens on the level, like there's some way that that happens actually on like the level of the contract and on the level
yeah.
of like how like work is conceived.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty, from what I understand, and I've seen one recently, the contracts for unscripted shows all work in that way. It's about the right to tell the story, and not like payment for time or anything like that, which is quite
Yeah.
interesting, especially when you consider like, reality show franchises like The Challenge or like, MTV, all of the Paramount reality shows, unscripted shows at this point that share stars, like they sign contracts to also like not appear on other networks shows, and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
um
So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we have had conversations at the Dockyard in the past about, this idea of the image release, the contracts that people are asked to enter in really quickly, and that oftentimes in documentary productions, like, get very little pushback. Like, when I have asked people to sign releases for my own films, like one person in hundreds that I've had signed has even asked about it. And for me personally, I try to walk everybody through what it is that they're signing so at least they understand it. But most people don't even
Mhm.
care. So, getting people like they're just like, oh, I don't care, I trust you, like sign it, like cutting me off in the middle of a sentence. So
Yeah.
quite interesting what happens. Um to return Bye Nina. To return to uh your film to shared resources. One of the things that also sets the film apart, which we haven't talked about yet, is the incorporation of visual descriptions and closed captions in every scene of the film. And the interesting thing about the closed captions is that the yellow text, you kind of have delineated two discursive spaces with different colored text, which you explain at the beginning. It operates very much in a structural film in that way. You explain the rules up front about what we're about to see, and then you adhere to those rules and refer back to them within the text and the audio of the film itself. So the yellow text are exactly kind of these reflections that you've asked your parents and your sister and that you do yourself, essentially in voiceover, providing visual descriptions upon every cut in the film. And then the captions record those visual descriptions, those audio, oral visual descriptions, as well as the dialogue that is ostensibly diegetic within the film. And here already, I already find it kind of interesting, because the film itself, it's not just your dad's story as much as perhaps he's advocating for that in the beginning. It's the story of your family. And so this is why I presume other voices and other people's wants and desires are also in the film. But also the visual descriptions aren't provided just by you. It's also a multiplicity of voices and shows us many different ways that visual descriptions can be provided, while also kind of rhetorically indicating differences in how people regard this raw material, perhaps at the specific point in time that you've asked everyone to record these voiceovers. But something quite interesting happens again in that interview with your dad about the 26 credit cards and his work as a collector, because there's an interlude where you use a technique that I see more and more in documentary film, which is when an interview or conversation that's filmed in observational format that we've seen prior is actually used as scaffolding voiceover. And in this film, where you have delineated the visual description voiceover in yellow and the diegetic dialogue in white in the captions, these actual voiceover voices in that scene still appear in white. And in your voiceover in the yellow text at that point, you are ruminating on how the documentary filmmaker can manipulate and cut dialogue in the edit. And it's getting quite messy at this point because there are things that are happening that you are not pointing out at this point on kind of the textual level of the film, but on the meta level. You've moved into the meta level of its production and of its editing. So I'm thinking about, so what is your directorial authority in voiceover? How are you considering this and balancing that, and like deciding what's important? The film does something quite interesting at that point, and I'm not so sure it's obvious, that move.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you close reading that part so carefully, because I do agree in some sense. I think in some way it's kind of like this cacophonous moment of like the different like structural devices kind of folding in on themselves, as well as like, it's this moment where I'm also just trying to work through my own trepidation about like working with a form that I like am highly skeptical of, like, because like, you know, I felt so aware from the, that this interview may be used as like a stand-in, to then like cover over all of the other kind of friction. And of course, like as you're saying, like where you use that was the kind of like the major thing that I was kind of trying to comment on, was this like trope in documentary of like being able to take the voice out of the body and then put it wherever you want it, so as to like create a mood or an atmosphere, or to like literally create like kind of like dialectical points, like that they're it's like, I guess it wouldn't be dialectical montage because it's like not like image, but it's like there is some kind of like quality of that, like that goes unmarked in most documentary productions that I've watched, where you know even just like this entire idea of like b-roll or something like this,
Yeah.
that you have this material that's there explicitly, like to be able to divorce the person from their context and surroundings. And so that's the kind of, that is the work, I guess, that those devices of access are trying to do to like deconstruct the film formally, with like marking the jump cut, are marking the the shift in even just like the fact that like we're not seeing him anymore, like, and that was sort of why I chose to repeat the same b-roll over and over again, was to kind of uh like not let that just like pass by on like passively, where like I imagine the early images where you're just like cutting to his face driving. I mean, I've seen that in so many documentaries,
Yeah.
where you're just like, you hear the person's driving down the road, and like they're talking, it's like as if we're hearing the thoughts inside their head, even though like they're not the thoughts inside their head. There's something that like are being specifically performed for the camera at that moment to create a desired effect that is usually elicited specifically by a particular question that the directors asked that we don't even hear. So I definitely want to mark that, and I don't know if it's successful or not, but that was really the thing I was thinking of. I was like, I want to find some way of like reminding the viewer, even if they're not sure why they're seeing the same thing 3 times, that this isn't just like some random image that you know, is being used here to like remind people he's the debt collector, you know, or something like, and he's at a bank. Like it's sort of like I imagined the way that I layered it, and I again don't know if it's successful, but the way I imagined it is I tried to like kind of build a new layer each time to like how that thing might get read, where it's like the first one is maybe just like for the literal like content of it, because there is actually something profoundly, we've already seen it once, but like there's still something profoundly upsetting for me each time my dad goes to the bank, of like that he's still banking at this place that fired him, you know, and that like he's in this kind of cycle. There's also like the element of it like very literal, you know, like we're talking about like extracting information, he's extracting money like from the ATM, like, you know, there are all of these kind of like more like basic associations that I wanted the viewer to draw from them. But then as that like kind of layering was happening, I also wanted it to be a kind of like unworking of those things at the same time. And so you asked like where my kind of like directorial, can you ask that part of the question again? Because I'm not sure that I've
Yeah, I
answered
guess
it yet.
I'm asking, like, how do you consider, okay, so I guess, I mean, so here's another, sorry, this entire, if anyone has questions at any point, please ask them in the chat, because now I'm just using Jordan as my documentary therapist to complain about all of the tropes that I find very upsetting in conventional documentary films, because there is this trope of, you know, something is happening, and then when the voiceover comes in, the levels on the sound for everything else get lowered, and then, you know, it's this singular authorial voice of God, as we call it, voiceover that predominates. And this is kind of a scene in which there's very few scenes other than this one in your film where somebody is talking on screen and we don't actually hear the audio from what they are saying, and instead it is your voiceover. And this is the most prominent to me moment where it happens, and at length, and over many different cuts. And while you may be describing the actual cuts that are happening, I mean, there's a couple of ways in which it works where it's like quite interesting to me. Because for one, when you describe the jump cuts in the interview with your dad, one of the lines that you say is, it indicates a jump forward or backwards in time. Which actually for me, I never considered a jump cut to be a jump backwards in time, because of the typical linearity and the, you know, cause and effect logic that usually guides those cuts. So it was actually a quite interesting directive from you, the director, to me as a viewer, to start considering jump cuts as also being jumps backwards in time, or perhaps a little sly signpost for what you yourself did. Like, is like you setting up the sound recorder actually performed because you realized you didn't get that you know, scene, for instance. So, you know, there are ways in which you're pushing back on this idea, and then other ways in which I find that your film is, not that this is a bad thing, still reinforcing those conventions. So I'm curious, like, how you were thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was like being very aware that like I'm not trying to say I'm not extracting information from my dad's like account. I am, you know, like you are meant to like piece together like, okay, like, you know, he had all of this debt, you know, his dad had all of this debt, like that must inform the way that he thinks about his career as a debt collector. Like that is a piece of information I'm extracting from it. It was more just like, I think the only thing I could think to do in that regard though is I'm like, this is a film that also is like dealing with key information. There's also like, as I say, like there's information he's not giving that I think is really important for the audience to know. Like in some ways he's like kind of covering over like key information. And there is this kind of like, I don't know, like there's some kind of like weird antagonism that could potentially like produce between the interviewer and the interviewee, where I'm like, I'm not out there trying to like catch my dad, like, why haven't you talked about like that chapter 13 bankruptcy is like so difficult to get out of. Like he does talk about it now, you know, I mean, he he talked in the MoMA Q&A about the fact that like, again, I never want to like quote statistics because then I'm like worried that they'll be inaccurate, but like, I don't know, I haven't said it again. I haven't said that, so I don't want to say it again. But anyway, he says something to the effect of like, you know, only like 8% of people in the area where my parents live like complete their plan. And like, that's something that they told them when they completed it, you know, and this is something that he's very proud of. So like, he has this one narrative of it. I also want to make sure that it's clear for the audience that like, that's a, you know, that's a thing to pause on and think about, because it is a very, you know, it is very difficult for me to think about, you know, what it is for my parents to be going through this process without thinking about the fact that it is set up for people to fail, you know, and, or at least to me, that's what those numbers suggest. So I am doing those, you know, I am doing the things that I'm like calling attention to.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel like, you know, I'm not sure if this is marked or not, but it's like, you know, to me, like marking the cuts, I'm also trying to prepare you for the fact that like, because I am cutting audio like underneath other images and I can conceal the cuts, there are concealed cuts there, you know, like there are moments where like I'm taking one thing that he said and putting it together with another thing because it like is clearer or more concise or things like this. And this is a thing that, you know, is a trope in editing that goes unmarked. And so I think kind of across the board, it felt to me like it was not my intention to try to like resolve these problematics or to I mean, I think in some sense I actually do want to propose the like, you know, that you do have this kind of like, you can't like just sign away the responsibility to the release from, like that's something I actually have like a concrete thought about. But I'm like, in terms of like formal devices that are taking something as it was said in one way and then making something new out of it, I mean, that's like what all editing is doing in some regard. And so that's like what I'm trying to do, you know, by calling attention to that. And I don't, you know, I don't know how other people perceive it, but that was, you know, that was my intention as the director and trying to direct people to the, exactly as you're saying, that, I mean, that was exactly my point with like, you know, drawing your attention to the fact that it can also be a cut backward in time because some of those things are like nonlinear even within the scene. And then of course the scene itself is this kind of like delving back into the past. So yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting because this is what differentiates sound from image, right? That like the temporality of sound can be mixed in ways that are undetectable. Whereas cuts, I mean, well, now we have like AI and all of these new technologies that are, you know, destroying this thesis as well, and they're becoming more and more accessible. But you know, visually, the cuts are indicated, but if when things are edited in the sound, they're not indicated, but that's also a function of how these different senses work in our perception. um I have more questions. So because you we're now on the topic of the captions, I would also just like to thank you, Jordan, and draw attention to the things that you did ask us to describe in our own image descriptions of promoting shared resources as a film on social media. You specifically asked us to indicate the race of people in images because you felt that whiteness can often get accidentally, perhaps not accidentally, erased in these image descriptions. But, you know, I definitely noticed that after reading your email asking us to do that, when I rewatched shared resources, I definitely noticed instances where you did that yourself in the film. But there are definitely other things that aren't described, like people's hairstyles or the types of clothes that people are wearing. And this is quite interesting to me because usually also I hate pronouncements about what documentary films do, but oftentimes in documentary films, these are visual signifiers that indicate to us class and so forth. What you were talking about, you know, the jump cuts in interviews, cuts to B-roll, these cutaways. They're often cutaways to objects in the room if the interview is taking place in a subject's home, as if this focus on objects and self-presentation reveals truths about the documentary subject. Um, but these visual markers for me as a documentary viewer, they tell me things also about the construction of the film. So for instance, when your hairstyle changes in between scenes, it tells me like, oh, like Jordan had the same like beard and like hair length. I think this was on one trip, and like, oh, it appears in different parts of the film, but this is one trip, and then this is another trip, and then this is how it's all edited together.
Right.
And it gives me indications about how it's all constructed. That can be faked, of course. Michael Glawiger, filmmaker, would pay subjects to wear the same clothes so that on multiple days of shooting, he could seamlessly cut everything together. And there are points in your film where you clearly indicate like the time and what's happening, the bookends of the film on that Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. But I'm curious for you, like, what is the, now that I've just spewed everything, how is this functioning for you in your film? What are you trying to intervene with here? Because it's not just providing the descriptive, it's not just serving a descriptive purpose either.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to this may be like too simple or something, but I actually think it's something that I view as like a very complex aspect of both what filmmaking is and also perception is. And but for me, a lot of what well, any artwork, but especially a film, because so much of how it's defined is by the frame, is like for me, description really shows simultaneously like the partiality of the frame, but also kind of like the insufficiency of like any like description of the frame. And so the description then becomes like another frame inside the frame. And the same with actually the caption also does. Like the caption is literally bounded by a frame and crops out parts of the frame, and creates a new frame. And so for me, that's like, I feel like I think about, like I actually like want to charge subjectivity like one layer deeper, because I don't think like subjectivity implies like there's only subjects, and of course there's also object, like there's a moment I think where subjects become objects as well in the film, and certainly within tropes of documentary. So I don't want to like make a claim to like just subjectivity, but I think the term that I feel like I identify most with, like in terms of how I think the description and access in general in the film operates, is through a lens of partiality, and the sense of like kind of thinking with my friend Amal Deblan, who wrote a thesis called Partial Figures, thinking about like the aspects of partiality that are also like, you know, as in like The Favorite, you know, or something like this too, like being partial to something. You know, that's a lot of how I think about my approach to description. And of course, you're like learning all of these different things about the ways that each person in the film is perceiving it. It may be different from how like the film's frame is directly mediating it, but I don't know how to fully account for that, because my presumption is also that like each viewer's perception of those things is also partial. You know, if they're sighted, if they're hearing, if they're you know, sighted and hearing, or deaf and sighted or hearing, and blind or deaf blind, you know, like there are all of these different possible places, and that's just along those two senses of how people may be engaging in the frame. But certainly each audience is having a partial experience of this thing, and the kind of presumption that the like rectangle that is the film frame is like the wholeness of it, I think, is a quite absurd notion, of course, right? Because we know the very notion of the frame is that it's like a cropping of everything that was around it as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cropping, but oftentimes too, it's an enlargement of what our own human eyes can perceive.
Right.
You know, like depending
Yeah.
on the
No,
camera.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and absolutely done in different ways because of the flattening of the plane. We've held you here for an hour, so thank you, um, Jordan. I guess the one last thing I would like to ask you about is about kind of the freedom in these constraints that you've set yourself. I mean, I guess that's also a terrible word to use, not that providing visual descriptions and closed captions are a constraint, but because you've set yourself this task of describing every single cut in
Yeah.
the film, you can't actually cut quickly, um, you know, and have those cutaways in the first place, you know, at half a second or even 1 second or 2 seconds. Um, I was also considering while watching your, you know, watching through the credits of your film today that a, you know, film with an enormously long cast and crew list would it would take a long time to read everybody's name out loud,
Yeah.
and I was just kind of idly thinking while watching today to prepare, like, oh, how long would that extend,
Yeah.
like a Marvel movie too. um so
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, what's interesting too is that I don't feel the lack of any of these bells and whistles when I watch your film. I'm curious if,
Mhm.
like, in terms of constructing, because I've called your film structuralist, and I've, like, you know, kind of, I'm very interested in what these sort of rules and these moves do to the form of the film in general. um what's the type of intervention that you were seeking to make in this space, if you were thinking in that way? Like, do you think of your film as like structuralist? Like, what were the rules that you set for yourself, I suppose?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the rules that I set for myself were definitely uh, to try as much as possible to mark out the film's construction, to allow the access features of the film around description and captioning to guide the duration in the actual like look of the frame, um, and to yeah, and to not like, I guess, like for me, because I feel like my answer about that, how I'm conceiving of the description, like, so unsurprisingly, it's partial and insufficient. And you know what I want to say as well about that is, like, I really think about those things quite similar to the way that I was thinking about like the question of like um, blocking the camera's view, like, you know, like replacing like one image with another, like of my finger over the lens. Because I think that in as much as it's like about a question of partiality, I think you're very right to say like the image itself like is very full. And I'm thinking actually about like all of these overlays and additions, like they're viewed through like very subtractive terms, like as if like uh you know, like to add access will like take away from your freedom, or like to add access will like take away from like the purity of the, you know, to add a caption to the image will like take away from its purity or something, or to take away from like what it can do. And I guess I think of it actually like in very additive terms, like where it's like it becomes like all that more complicated and all of that more rich and all that more dense, where then that's like another, maybe it's actually more useful to think of it as like a frame inside of a frame, you know, like, and that like this is another place we could go through. There's something dense about it, and so I wanted to work with access as like a, you know, I mean, I did have like a very didactic purpose in doing that. Like I do actually believe that like filmmakers should integrate access for blind and low vision people and for deaf and hard of hearing audiences, because those audiences are already in the audience. And if you're not doing that, like then you're not directing your film for those audiences. And it's not to say that those audiences then aren't making their own forms of access to, to engage with the film. But I want that that kind of desegregation of my audience along lines of ability, because I think it's also a means of like kind of challenging the just two-ness or something of, linking the audio to the senses, seeing and hearing, when of course like all of the senses may be engaged in that, like and beyond the senses, like many different forms of relation between people, and like there's so many different ways in which senses are being mediated as well, in a person's experience of a film. And so I wanted to work with audio description and captioning as a way of like pointing in a direction that film is maybe also haptic, that it's also maybe happens in this space of relay between people, that's not just about the image is the definitive thing that the film is, the sound is the definitive thing the film is, but actually like all of the things that happen in between that get the image into like people's perception, perception, or the sound into people's perception. And so every time I've answered a question, I'm not sure if I've answered it, but those were the kind of the things I was thinking about. And yeah, I guess the last thing I can say is, I'm very interested in the idea of, of course, like the finger over the lens, like what I liked about it is it reminded me of like like a Paul Schuret's Flickr film or something like this, and I wanted it to look like that, but I was like, what if that thing did have this like very particular meaning as well, and to and maybe in a sense also like it's a structuralist film, and I don't want to like overstate the claim, but like I've tried to think about it as much like also like a materialist film as well. Like there's something like material about the ways that film is made and the ways that like bodies are both like how a film is made, but also like an obstacle to like or like they form like an interference pattern in making it whatever it is. So
Yeah.
sorry, that was long-winded. And I know we need to wrap up, but that's the thing I was thinking about.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing your thought process with us. It's incredibly rich and revealing and definitely gave me lots to think about. I will say also the finger covering the lens, and hopefully someone listening in chat can help me out with the name of this film. But in Wavelengths a few years ago, one filmmaker like put a sheet of paper over the camera lens and then just filmed people walking by. Do you know what I'm talking about, Jordan? Someone in chat, please help me out.
Yeah.
It's called, yeah.
Yeah. I think I've heard of this film before. I don't think I've seen it, but I've definitely heard of it.
Yeah, and there's something about like the estrangement of that and of knowing, it's. I was also talking with a friend recently about the preponderance of experimental filmmakers who work like with photochemical film and work in the very like working with the material of the film, the flicker film avant-garde tradition, have failing eyesight in some ways, and then seem
Right.
to move into that tradition. So there definitely is a link there, I feel like,
Yeah.
with film
Yeah.
haptics. Yeah. So thank you so much again. And yes, Rachel says, thank you. Really interesting film. I'll never look at the documentary genre through the same lens again. Me too, Rachel.
Wow.
I totally agree with that.
That's really, really nice to hear. But thank you. I'm so grateful that you're here, Rachel. And thank you so. I mean, I'm really, really glad to take part in this conversation with you, Abby. I feel like you're asking me the questions like I've been asking myself, and so I think that's why I'm still having a hard time answering them. But I really, really want to like continue this conversation and like
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, your
it's really,
film
really
is
neat.
swinging for the fences. It's asking the big questions, and it's going really far. We didn't even get to the contract signing scene because I had so many questions about the interview that preceded it, and it's something that I'm incredibly interested in because also, I mean, it's representations of thriving and ethics of care are also big trendy words these days, and I find that scene really interesting and how it addresses all of that. So yes, oh my gosh, Aparna, thank you. Yes, fabric. um Oh, that's another one. Yes, Christoph Radichko. Yes, that's another one. That's not what I was thinking of, but thank you for that installation. So we also have thanks from Akram and Linda, programmers I
Yeah.
admire very much, both of them. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a good night.